Hi everybody. Next we're going to look at portfolio development and what are some of the aspects we need to consider in terms of that, because clearly you're going to develop a webfolio, which is an alternative name for an e-portfolio, as the submission for this module. So clearly we need to get to grips with some of the issues around planning, development, maintenance and enhancement of a portfolio. Okay, so we're going to look at some of the ways in which you can get started, and clearly within the workbook there are going to be some activities to help get you underway. We'll also start to explore some of the issues around the development and maintenance of portfolios, and a key thing just to mention at this point is that there's a significant amount of information and support within the module handbook which you can find embedded earlier in the workbook, which you can use to supplement this presentation as well. Okay, one of the things to clarify initially is to think in terms of profiles and portfolios, what's in a name, because here for example, if you think, for those of you that are UK based, in terms of Healthcare Professions Council, their requirement is that you submit a profile of evidence when you're audited for CPD, so they don't want to see the whole CPD portfolio that houses everything that you've got in terms of your CPD. They want a profile. Okay, and it's important to be able to make a distinction between them. Now the easy way to think about it is the portfolio you could think of as the bag that you put everything in. And the good thing from that point of view is that how you organise and structure it doesn't really matter. The key thing is that it suits you and that it works for you. So there's no right or wrong in that, which is great. Okay, but it's important we get to grips with the distinction between them. Now I'm going to show you a couple of definitions, and these are the ones that really work for me in terms of highlighting what the differences are, but you may find others that help and are even better for you, so don't restrict yourself to the definitions that I prefer. But it's the work of Brown that's really put this into context for me, where he describes a personal portfolio as a private collection of evidence. And remember, your portfolio is contained within your personal learning space within PebblePad. Nobody sees it unless you decide to share it with an individual or with a tutor for feedback or comment. So a private collection of evidence, and demonstrating all of these aspects. But the key thing for me in terms of this definition is that the portfolio's got to have a retrospective dimension, so the looking back, a prospective dimension, which is the looking forward and your professional development planning, that kind of thing, as well as reflecting the current stage of your development as an individual and a practitioner. So that definition I feel works very nicely for me. The profile, by contrast, is a collection of evidence which is drawn from that particular portfolio, so from the bag that you put everything in, that you pull together for a particular purpose and for the attention of a particular audience. So for example, if you were applying for a new post, instead of sending a CV, what you might actually draw together is a profile of evidence that shows how you satisfy and meet the requirements on the role description that you're applying for. So you could actually produce a profile of evidence to show that you meet the role specification. So that for me would be the easiest way to make the distinction between them. Now in terms of where you go and where you start in terms of getting your portfolio going, it's always difficult to get started, but a situational analysis is a good way of getting going. It's an essential point within the portfolio anyway. It's something that you have to do, but it allows you to consider where you've come from, where you are at this point in time, and how you can prospectively look to see where you're going and plan and identify your development needs. So that would be a really good way of getting going. So a few tips around that in terms of a situational analysis. You could actually start off by revisiting your CV. That's a good starting point. How long is it since you actually had a look at that and refreshed it? But crucial within a situational analysis is having a look at your current job description and your scope of practice, and actually see whether or not you actually fulfill the requirements of the role still. So if you do feel you fulfill all the requirements of your job description, would you be able to provide evidence of that? Because that would be something that would be important to do. And if you do fulfill them all, and you're quite content that you do, you should then think about looking for a job description for the next grade up, or where you see your career going, to identify which aspects you already satisfy, but also which aspects you need to develop, because that then starts and provides you with material for your action plan or your professional development plan. And you can actually prospectively start and look at ways in which you can address those perceived deficiencies. Okay, so that would be a useful thing to do. Also, if you're looking at your current job description and there are still aspects of it that you don't think you do fulfill, again, those can go on your action plan as well, and you can identify those as development needs and tick them off as you get them done. Okay, the next part, which is another useful way of getting started with your webfolio or your portfolio, is a self-appraisal. Now, some people find this really, really difficult and challenging, but it is a crucial section to commit to. It's really important because awareness of self in this context is really quite powerful. What you might actually find, though, is if you've got any feedback from appraisals, performance reviews, that kind of thing, that might be helpful because it offers you an alternative insight as well. And the other thing to think about is don't just sit there and ruminate and try and think in terms of, well, what are my strengths, what are my areas for development, that kind of thing. Do bear in mind sometimes it takes two to know one, and there's nothing wrong with asking colleagues, mentors, line managers for a considered professional opinion of you as a practitioner, because quite often how other people perceive you is very different to how you perceive yourself, and you might be pleasantly surprised. Something that you think is maybe an area for development, they might actually consider to be one of your strengths. So I would recommend that you do actually try and do this. Colleagues can be a bit uncomfortable about doing that and committing it to paper, but maybe an easy way to do that would be to give them a list of what you perceive to be your strengths and areas for development and let them comment on that, rather than sort of give them a blank piece of paper and say, could you write down what you think my areas for development might be. So self-appraisal would be really important as a way of getting going. So in terms of workbook activity, you could write down a list of your strengths and areas for development, and remember, we don't call them weaknesses, these are opportunities for development. So we only have opportunities for enhancement and development, they're not weaknesses. And do be honest about this, because if you can't be honest with yourself, there's not much hope. Once you get this list generated, one of the things you can do later on when you start thinking in terms of providing evidence of your CPD is, if you're identifying these things as strengths, how could you provide evidence for them? What could you supply that would evidence that those are actually strengths? So one of the things we've got you underway with in the workbook a little bit further down is to try and contribute to a Padlet where you post your thoughts about what are the strengths and weaknesses of our profession, and that might help you get started in terms of thinking about your own strengths and areas for development. Are there any that resonate from the strengths and weaknesses that you identify from the profession? There might be things that you can actually add onto that. Now, in terms of how you organise and structure the portfolio, again, we did say as long as it works for you, there's no right or wrong in terms of that. Things that are probably going to be unhelpful, though, are if you only keep your portfolio as a diary, that kind of thing. The literature also says portfolios are unhelpful if you do them for others rather than yourself, and this is a tricky one in the context of this module, because it's a mandatory module, so you've got to do it, but also the assessment for the module is developing the portfolio as well. But hopefully you'll come to recognise that actually through producing the module, Webfolio, it is actually very powerful for you, and although you're having to do it for the module, hopefully you'll actually find it to be a significant benefit to you. Clearly portfolios are not helpful if they're rigid and can't be adapted to or added to over time, so that's something that you need to consider as well. Clearly this is going to be an electronic portfolio, it's going to be very flexible, and you're going to be able to develop this quite significantly over time. Things that the literature say do help in terms of developing it is if it's flexible, so electronic, written for yourself, and that's a key thing in terms of this module. Although there are learning outcomes and assessment criteria to satisfy, I really do want to write it for you, write it for yourself, and that way you'll get the most from it. Clearly you need to divide it into sections. You've got to include things like targets and goals in terms of your professional development planning. But the key thing for me is that after the module, that you continue to use it. It remains live, developmental, professionally useful, and you continue to grow, develop, enhance it as you go along. So those things are quite important. In terms of the contents, again, these are very individual, but things that people commonly include would obviously be things like a CV, evidence of qualifications, that kind of thing. Things like pivotal incidents, where these are the real light bulb moments, so the things that happen to you in practice that really change the way in which you think about your practice, or change the way in which you deal or interact with patients or respond to situations, that kind of thing. I'm sure you can call some of those to mind. Obviously, documenting other forms of reflection. Things like if you've published any articles or co-written any articles, or you've been involved in any projects, or the production of leaflets, information guides, that kind of thing. A whole range of things could go in there. Anything where you've got some form of assessment or evaluation or review of your performance by others, so appraisals, reviews, that kind of thing. Feedback on modules, for example, previous modules that you've studied, you could quite easily produce an evidential package that shows this was the article, or this was the assignment that I produced, this was the feedback that I received, and these are the development needs I've identified that I've put on my action plan as a result that will feed forward to the next module. So a whole range of things there in terms of potential content. Clearly, hopefully you're going to find portfolios to be a valuable learning tool to help you structure and organise your learning and make some sense of your learning experience as well. I think it does provide you with a significant opportunity to maximise the learning that you gained, but also helps you to cross-reference different strands or themes that emerge from your portfolio. You'll maybe not see this initially, but as your portfolio comes closer to development just prior to submission, you'll start and see links and themes emerging, and you'll be able to cross-reference through your portfolio to that. That's when it becomes something that's quite high level, and that's when you really start and score higher in terms of the marks that you gain. Okay, and finally, in terms of uses of portfolios, lots of reasons for that. Obviously, evidencing CPD, it provides a good record of your personal and professional development. As we talked about profiles before, as being drawn from a portfolio, you can use those to support job applications. You can use it as a framework for staff appraisal. Clearly it helps organise your learning, that kind of thing. So there's a whole range of uses of portfolios, and you'll no doubt come across others in the literature as we go through. Okay, so if you have any questions at that point, clearly by now you know where to go to post these, and you've got the link to the queries and conversations thread in the workbook. So if you've got any queries about this presentation, please do get back to me. Cheers.